Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Groeschel, and I'm super happy to be speaking with Robin Codding today about her work in math and intervention. As everybody knows, this is a show sponsored by John Capp from Hodder Education. John Capp publishes some of the best books in education, including my new book, Just Tell Them: The Power of Explanations and Explicit Teaching. So definitely follow the links that I give you in the show notes and go check that out. Robin, it's been a long time that I've wanted you to be on this show. We've had some of your colleagues on here already, but we saved the best for last, I think, of the of the math nerds. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I love being called a math nerd. I think that's awesome. I'm happy to be here.
And we're going to be talking about your areas of expertise. You sent me a ton of things to read, and so I've done a little bit of homework. I'm excited to talk about your research and what you've been doing lately. Let's start with this. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
So I'm a professor of school psychology. I have been at 4 different universities, which I think is great because it gives me a lot of different perspectives of what's happening in different places in the country. And early in my career, I was an educational behavioral consultant. I think that was really meaningful to me because when I think about some of the conversations that we're going to have, I really think about the idea of data and how we use data on a regular basis. And I was really lucky that in this professional learning experience, I was able to engage in database instruction to address individual, class, and school level learning challenges. So I think that was particularly useful and really directed what I do. As you said, my research is on, the way I phrase it is integration of assessment, intervention, and implementation for school-based academic interventions. But as you noted, most of my work is in math. But I guess that's like a really long way of saying I like to investigate the use of the multi-tiered system of support in math.
The main thing I want to say very quickly is how I just think MTSS is either misunderstood or just not really being implemented in so many schools. But that's why you're here. We'll kind of address how we can kind of fix those things. We'll start with this question, and this is around treatment intensity, right? I was an interventionist for several years, and we kind of had to make it up as we go as interventionists. So how do we intensify instruction for students who have the largest gaps in our schools?
Yeah, I love this question, and I so appreciate your work as an instructional consultant. I think that's amazing. I love talking to instructional consultants because I always feel like we're on the same page. And I feel like for a long time, we kind of just sort of pushed the answer to this question down the road. And I think we sort of are in a place now where we might have some answers. So I'm going to frame it in that MTSS world for a minute. But one of the things early on, like in 2004, it was suggested by Barnett and colleagues that really the whole MTSS framework hinges on this layered support and differentiation of intensity. And that the technical adequacy, so you mentioned how hard it might be to do, relies on accurate decision rules going between those tiers and judging actually treatment intensity. And I think it's been confusing to folks because sometimes treatment intensity was conflated with like teacher expertise or with actually group size. So this idea that if we're going to make something more intense for a student, then it has to be one-on-one instruction. And we know we have enough data to suggest that that's not actually the case, and that's not the avenue we want to go down. And so there is a framework and a process for doing that I think at this point has started to become more clear. Intensity can also refer to dose, things like how many sessions per week, how long are those sessions, what happens in those sessions, how many teaching episodes are in those sessions, what's the total duration. So there are some things we know. And one of the things that happened early on when MTSS was rolled out, and this was really happened corresponding at the beginning of my career, was that this debate between using data and kind of identifying what does the student actually need and then matching those needs with a standard protocol approach, which is where we pick an intervention program that we have identified, usually they're commercially available, and we implement them, right? And I think what we learned, so the process that won ultimately was the standard protocol. People were like, all right, we're going to pick the program, right? We're going to intervene when students are struggling, And that's how we'll solve the problem. And so what ended up happening, right, is that not all standard protocol interventions are going to fit all students' needs. So we have to be able to make adaptations to those programs. And so, like you said, how do we do that without making it up? And I think the answer is there is a strategy and an approach to carefully engaging in that process and making those adaptations. But we didn't have a framework for doing that before, and I think we are starting to have one. So this is like I'm giving you all these foreshadowing. So I'll get to what I think that is. So one of the things we want to think about, of course, and the one that I highlight often is that one-on-one instruction is not intensifying instruction. That's not what we mean. What we actually mean is individualizing instruction, not individualize. And those are two distinctly different things. And that's the emphasis that needs to be had when we're thinking about the students that really have the largest gaps between current and expected performance. So when I think about that, and in reading, they have great data on group size, actually. And there's some emerging data by Ben Clark and Christian Dobler that is starting to pick up on some of the nuances in math. But the reading data is Sharon Vaughn and colleagues, and they really clearly showed that one-to-one is not the answer. Like you can get the same outcomes in small groups, and which is really great news, right? Because we know how cost constraints can impact that in terms of resources and in terms of feasibility in schools. So it's great. We can use small groups. And then people will say, well, what's the data in math? And the data emerging in math is that, again, we don't need one-to-one. Small groups work. 2-to-1, 5-to-1, we actually have some nuanced data in there. If you have groups of 5, you tend to get more peer-to-peer interaction. And in groups of 2, you get more frequent and high quality individual opportunities to practice. So that, again, that's from that Clark and Dobler work. So I think that's really interesting. The other thing about groups is, which takes a lot of effort, but I think it's worth it in the long run, is that these groups need to really be homogeneous. And we have some good study data by the same group. I think Sutherland was the lead on that paper that shows that if you have more variability in skills with the students that you have in your group, the gains are going to be smaller. So what that to me means is that we know a few things about what we can do to individualize and intensify instruction. We know that we can use small groups. We know those groups have to include homogeneous skills. The students in those groups have to have the same kinds of challenges and the same maybe areas of strength. So it means we have to actually look at our data. We also kind of know that, and we've done some of these studies, that more frequent sessions are helpful. So the IES practice guide in 2009 said, hey, 3 to 5 sessions per week. We had a study that says 4 sessions might be best. So thinking about, daily doses, we also know that the time in those daily doses is constrained. So is that really something we want to vary, or do we want to think about other ways to individualize performance? So let's maximize what we know, give intervention every day, and then think about some of these other factors, intervention every day in small groups.
So you mentioned a few things that I feel like we kind of had in place, but one of them is around looking at the assessment data, right? What we would do is not to pick on iReady, but we would have our iReady 3 times a year, and we would have the students do that as part of it. Would take a week, right? So we're losing 3 weeks of instruction, just on assessment. We take the iReady test, and it gives us like 4 strands. One is a number, and the other one's on measurement, and so on. And it shows which is their weakest in it. And you drill in deeper, and then it gives like suggested things to work on with students. And number one, how confident can we be that that is a sensitive enough measurement to create these groups? And number two, like, if it's not that great of a measure, like what are some other options for schools that do want, because I didn't feel like we could get the information we needed out of those tests to create these type of groups.
Yeah, exactly. So the computer adaptive, so I'm a curriculum-based, I guess I should back up. I am an expert in curriculum-based assessment and measurement. And so that to me is like the tool. Along the way, there was, computer adaptive tests. And the idea was, even from some of my mentors who were experts in curriculum-based assessment, they said, hey, this could be awesome, right? This could be great for schools. We have a way to individualize off of these tests that is done not by, that is done on the computer. But turns out, right, that you are exactly right. Like your experience is common. I think many schools and teachers' experiences, because they didn't have that curriculum-based measurement platform embedded. And I was a couple times in a row, I've given these workshops on updates and assessment. And I've said, hey, by the way, did you notice that a lot of these computer adaptive tests are actually embedding curriculum-based measurement tool options? And I think that's because that is hands down the best way to monitor progress. So when you start with that like standard protocol intervention, you have to monitor progress on the immediate skill. The other challenge that you're talking about is, what are we measuring? And what we're measuring is going to be, we think, two different things based on the data. One is grade level skills, because we have to look at how are students progressing in their grade level skills. But the grade level skill, usually in math, contains lots of different things across multiple areas. And so we have to know what the immediate skill is that we're working on. And we have to start with that skill. So we call that mastery measurement. So you have to use mastery measurement. That changes along the way. It's the short-term progress. And then you have to use what we used to call general outcome measures, which are the larger measures that really capture all of the grade level skills. And so it's really a two-pronged measurement system. So this is not, as you've already kind of alluded to, super simple. I think you have to devote your energy and time to reorganizing how you're going to do this. And then it becomes super simple. But at the start point, it feels probably overwhelming.
And you mentioned earlier, like you get some students together, but because we don't have that grade of measures in a lot of schools, what happens is you do have your quote unquote most at-risk students in some of these groups, but even within those groups, there can be so much variability. You have a child who's completely missed most of their education. They are struggling even with maybe forming their numbers, right? And right next to a student who they are in the low group, but they're quite a bit farther along. They're maybe operating at a third grade level in skills, and you're at a middle school context. So it's like you still get the situation where you're going to maybe have someone who falls outside of all your groups and that you have to meet with individually. But maybe it's a little more rare than how much we use one-on-one instruction in some schools.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're thinking about it exactly right. That's how I would think about it too. So there may be a case where you're doing one-on-one instruction because there is no other choice. To start with that, though, doesn't make logical sense. And then, we can think about the broader issue logistically in schools is how many children are you trying to service through intervention? And is it the case that you actually need to go back to tier one? You can't tier 2 and 3, you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem is the common phrase that people like to use. So when do you have the adequate resources to deliver the services that you need in the way that's best for the kids that you're working with? And then you could have some of that wiggle room that you talked about, where if there's a one-to-one situation, you would have that.
What about logistics? Like, let's say you really are in charge of this, of your school's MTSS team and committee and protocol, and you're really starting from square one to get this thing together. Like, how would you, if you came into a school and just did it the best way possible, what would that look like?
So the resource that is going to be really helpful that I'm going to refer to is from the National Center for Intensive Intervention, NCII, and the framework is called database instruction. It started out as database individualization, so some people use both terms, and I really grabbed onto it because it's essentially it's familiar to me because that's what we did in grad school. That's what we did in the schools that we were working with during our training. So it was that blending of the standard protocol approach with this data-informed adaptation piece. So here's what I would do. First, you got to pick your standard protocol intervention because it is useful to have something that everybody can get trained on. So you have to find that. Sometimes in math, it may be a different program for a different grade. And so I think that's certainly a logistical challenge. But on the flip side, some of the ones that are driven by researchers or built through research funding are cheaper than some of the commercially available ones. So you find what that protocol is. And remember, it's not going to work for everybody. So monitor progress. The two ways that I said. A lot of these curriculums come with their own, what they call, like maybe they call curriculum-based tools that they use, or there's another term that's being used. But anyway, they have their own tools that monitor how kids are doing inside of the program. You can use that in lieu of a mastery measure. And then you're going to look at your grade level progress, right? And you're monitoring and you're looking at it regularly. So not every 3 months, more like every 6 weeks is what you want to be looking at. And some tools are better at capturing that small growth, and other tools are better at capturing the long-term growth. So that's something that you'll need to know. So when the student is not making progress, then you can figure out why. That's when you go and you do your drill down, more like in a curriculum-based assessment framework. And of course, that we know is easier for whole number computation. There's some ways you can do it with beginning rational number knowledge as well, but it's harder on other topics, and that's certainly a challenge. You're going to look at your progress. You're going to see what you think the problem is. Where are the gaps? And then you're going to do a couple of different things. So the framework or the taxonomy that exists, I've sort of adapted from a couple sources. The main source is Fuchs, and Malone, and that's called the Taxonomy of Intervention Intensity, and that's on NCII. And I like to think about it, okay, we need to adapt the instructional components. We need to maybe include behavior supports or self-regulation strategies. We already are going to say that we're maximizing the frequency of the intervention. So then we need to think about, can we change the length of the session, which we already said is restricted. So how about the total duration? Like, we don't expect the student to make gains in 12 weeks, right? It's going to be a longer period of time. Change the level of assistance. We need to understand where the student is in the skill hierarchy, which I know you like to talk about, the instructional hierarchy, and figure out, all right, have we been trying to have them build fluency when they need to build acquisition? Have they been building acquisition, which I've actually heard happen? Have they been building acquisition in the same skill for like years? And we need to have a different approach that we're taking with those students. We also tend not to go back to the prerequisite skill. Math is aggressively hierarchical. We got to go back to that foundational skill, break down the tasks, and reduce how much content you're covering. So which of those things do we think as a team are going to be the most important for the student based on the data that we have? So do we need to change our instructional components? Do we need to add our behavioral supports? Word problems, for example, if you're focusing on a word problem solving curriculum, one of the things that we've noticed in some of the work that we've done is that, well, hey, they can't actually solve the word problem, not because they don't understand the word problem process, but because they don't actually know how to do multi-digit computation. So they can't solve that problem. So then the answer is, I need to teach about multi-digit computation. So thinking about adapting that intervention, including behavior supports and self-regulation, changing maybe the length or duration of the intervention, changing the level of assistance based on matching student strategies to their needs, and adjusting the skill. So just having that menu and saying, okay, which of the things make the most sense? At the bottom of this menu is change groupings, but that's hard, by finding better student matches or smaller teacher-student ratios.
Perfect. So you're working with students and you've selected this protocol. One pitfall I often find is that once we know what they need to be working on, we've decided on the intensity of what they need to be working on, then it comes down to selecting resources that will help you teach that material. And then that ends up falling apart. The interventionist has like 20 groups and the students it's like planning 20 different lessons all the time. And so, I mean, what do you know about sort of resources that are coming out that help match the student's entry point into the program with actual resources? And then they actually have measurement, continuous measurement tools that are embedded, because this is what schools are always asking me. How do I set this up? How do I go and purchase this and get this going in my school?
Yeah, I mean, this is the dream, right? And so I think I do a consultation with a couple of different companies that I won't name, but my sense is that they're working on that now and they understand the need for that. Is it out there? I mean, you have Amanda's Spring Math that's out there. That's probably the closest thing there is to it, but I think that there is more of an interest in building that already ready to go for folks. In the meantime, though, I think it's not unlike, and I like to give sort of this intervention grid and have people plan this out. What are the standard protocol interventions that you're going to use for the key content areas, which I know we haven't talked about, but you want to talk about? And what is the tool that we have available or that we can find that we're going to use that measures the progress on that particular topic area? And then what is the entry and exit criteria that we have? If you can start with that organizational system, then you can go and say, okay, if we need to adapt the intervention, what are we going to do? What do we have available to us? And that's when I think you can do really simple things like when we're talking about self-regulated or metacognitive instruction, it's like just teaching kids heuristics and mnemonics. Like kids have a hard time starting and persisting with problem solving tasks, give them a checklist, have them. So there are simple ways, I think, to add those instructional components. The other thing I find, and maybe this hasn't been your experience, but my experience has been that there's a lot of students that actually need behavioral supports too, embedded in their intervention. And we also see challenges there, right? If you don't have folks that are dual trained and comfortable in doing that. But you can use really simple strategies, even whole groups, like just simple group contingencies around building that in as well. So I think there are simple things and strategies that you can identify that could fall under each of those changes that you would make, but you have to plan it ahead. So it does require, so to me, if I was in a system where we said, okay, we know that this is a challenge, we know that we have interventions, we know that we have some resources and tools, we need to sit down and figure out how it fits in this block. So if we're talking about K-8 education and we want to intervene, what are we going to intervene with for what problem? What's the entry point? What's the exit point? What are the tools that we have? And then what are the ways in which we can take these adaptations and use them? What do we have available to use them?
I want to talk to you about the behavioral supports piece, because that's interesting, right? A lot of times schools will assume that a student's academic challenges are because of behavior, where the arrow is in the opposite direction, right? A lot of times their behaviors they're expressing are just in response to really feeling not supported or not being able to access the material. So you get them into my group and all of a sudden they're like a transformed different child, right? They're working at material at their level. They have a more structured classroom. They have a smaller group size. They have maybe a more experienced teacher. But then there's the other experience I've had too, which is that they really struggle with both. Are you saying there's a way you can kind of imagine weaving in the kind of the behavior skills with the academic skills in an intervention setting?
Yeah, and I think that they actually have a couple of sort of rubrics on the NCII about this. So I haven't tried to relocate them recently, but I have definitely downloaded them in in the past, which starts either with the behavior challenge is the primary, and then there's corresponding academic issues, or starts with the academic issue as primary, and there's corresponding behavior issues. And I think for me, the biggest thing is we give students choice, right? We provide students with opportunities to work as a team or in a peer group setting. So building social skills in that way, there's plenty of data on that peer-based piece. So you can build that into your small group intervention. Again, makes that small group intervention potentially work for you, even more effectively than you envisioned. And using group contingencies, we use a version of the good behavior game called the You and Me game, and that came from my colleague John Begany. But we talk a lot about like, okay, we're gonna get points for making sure that we're talking only about math, that we're supporting our peer, our friends, and we are really trying our best. And so we get points for that. And then if that doesn't happen, then the teacher gets points. And then you compare at the end, well, and usually it's the case that the teacher always loses. And we say to the students, how many more points did you get than the teacher? By how much more did you win? I've done this in places where there was other folks in the system that were doing intervention work in the same space. And they said, hey, I need to do that. How are you getting them engaged? So just doing some of those things, I think, can be really helpful because, like you said, you're already controlling a lot of the other instructional components that have led them in the larger setting to have less success.
And let me let me talk about this version. I call it the teacher student game. You're talking about like the T chart, right? Where you have the yeah. One of my main tips I tell people that it was an aha moment for me was that is to name the behavior that day during that lesson that you really want them to be focusing on, and not make that behavior game be around all of the things you could possibly do, right? It's up to me to judge you on everything you do, and it's sort of a secret which behavior I'm targeting. I would always go up and say, so we're all answering in unison today. We all answer together, right? And that's all we really focused on, or maybe one or two other things, but not many more than that. And then just reinforcing verbally, just like, oh my goodness, we are all responding together. Listen to this. We are all right. And then you get a really nice buzz. I wish more interventionists had that in their toolkit. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, totally. I love it. And only in maximum 3. Like, I don't think I've ever tried to do more than 3. Yeah, because your intervention session's not that long. Yes, exactly.
And it creates a little pocket of their day that can be so successful. That's my favorite part about it. So you mentioned content. I think that's important. It's a huge question people ask me, is like, math feels hierarchical in a lot of ways. Bigger problems contain smaller problems. What do I do to like respect that hierarchy and also like target things that are sort of, high leverage, high impact skills, and in what order? Could you answer that for us?
Well, I'm going to give you my best take. How about that? I've looked at this in the past, is thinking about like, how do we think about math learning disabilities? When we think about math learning disabilities, we really kind of have 2 major categories. There's lots that we don't know about math learning disabilities, but the things that we seem to know is that there's calculation issues and there's issues with word problems. So I like to start with that. And then there's this great data that came from Bryant and colleagues that I always reference. At this point, I think it's like an early 2000 study, but they identified with teachers and special education teachers something like 30 different math challenges that students experience. But of those, they could narrow them down and identify the most common ones. So the most common ones were math word problems, actually checking your work, so a process thing, math fact recall, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone at this point, right? They also found multi-digit calculation. So actually understanding that place value order was a challenge as well. And math language. So to me, I think, okay, we have now narrowed down what the main challenges are. So, and I emphasize K-8 education because that's really where I do this work and I have the most knowledge. So I think for those of you not in K-8, I have some ideas, but I'm not as knowledgeable about that space. So to me, and you take all that, and then you look at something that happened in 2009, is there was a RTI, at that time we called MTSS RTI, right? RTI guide on math by Gersten and colleagues. And they said, hey, these are the main content areas. K5, whole number knowledge. 4 to 8, and there's a little overlap there, you can see. Rational number knowledge. Those are the goals. And those are the goals because we know that those are 2 of the prime areas that are predictive of algebra. They're 2 of the key components, and that came from the National Math Panel. So I'm like, okay, when I talk about it, I say, great, let's narrow that down. So we have K to 5 is whole number knowledge. What do we need to know within whole number knowledge? Well, we have to understand number, right? We have to know bigger, smaller. We have to know number line. We have to have that basic idea of what number is. So things like strategic counting, magnitude, comparison, composition, and decomposition. We need to know number operations. So simple and complex number operations. And we need to know, and along with complex, of course, would be place value. And we need to know how to do word problems with whole numbers. That's it. So where do you fall in that space? On the rational number side, it's really kind of similar. We have to understand magnitude of rational numbers. Like, what is a fraction actually? How do we define a fraction? We have to be able to do operations with decimals, fractions, and percentages. And we have to have teaching of word problems with those spaces. So to me, when you break it down that way, and we have all this data that shows that those 2 skills are really predictive of algebra, and then we also know that whole number knowledge is predictive of rational number knowledge. So that's all come out in the last decade. And I think that's really exciting because to me, that narrows it down. So bucket 1, whole number knowledge, we have 3 areas, right? We're talking about what is a number? Number operations, word problem solving. Bucket 2, pretty similar. What is a fraction? How do we think about rational numbers? What are number operations and what are word problems? And then we start with our screening. So where's the whole? Is a whole both in whole number and rational number knowledge? If the answer is yes, you start with whole number knowledge and figure out where it is. If that's fine, then you start with rational number knowledge and figure out where that whole is.
Really nice. And I guess a question I get a lot is like you see a student isn't making progress in something that you consider a prerequisite for moving on to the next thing, and they're just sort of trapped in that space, right? And it's felt maybe like that the intervention is the problem, right? That they could be back in a whole group setting. They're losing out on that opportunity in order to get something, and they're not making any progress. Um, is there a risk of holding kids back to earlier and earlier math, and would it be better addressed in in a mainstream setting? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question right here. I should have known you were going to ask me this. No, it is because one thing that happens is I think we don't, going back to our earlier conversation about how do we intensify and adapt our interventions, we're not good at that. We're not fluent enough at that, if you will. And so we haven't been able to see, okay, I went back to the prerequisite skill, but I'm still giving way too much content at one time, right? I need to further reduce the set size, or I need to break down the task, or I need to give other, like I need to show the student how this problem works from the beginning to the end, and they need to be able to use a checklist to do that work. So I think there's some of those pieces wrapped up in that question. The other thing that we do not talk about enough is how, and as school psychologists, we certainly should, in my field, and we should be communicating that out effectively, is like, how do you use accommodations with interventions? And for some of these kids, right, that have those really large gaps, they haven't made a lot of gains, they're really struggling to access that core level content, let's say in 7th and 8th grade, and they don't have those foundational skills. Well, then we need to start providing accommodations to that student to be able to actually access that grade level content, so they're learning in that setting too. And I don't know that we merge those things very well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a prevailing idea right now, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If they can't access the math, the problem is with the math. And so even mainstream settings start to create these kind of these little these problems that they call low bar, high ceiling type problems, which have like no real answer. A great example I saw in a classroom was count the number of squares on a checkers board, and of course it's not just the number of squares; they create more squares. So there was like a lot of answers, and the kids spent an hour doing this task. It involves and it includes the kids that typically would be an intervention. They can be busy during it, but it doesn't teach anybody math. And so I don't even know if that's a question. It's something I have observed, and I wanted to bring that to you.
Yeah, no, I totally can respond to that, because to me, I think this is one of those classic questions that is why we are here where we are with math, which is we don't actually know what our outcome is. With reading, we know what the outcome is. What is the outcome in math? And I think there's been some more conversation about what are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do, right, in K education, I think, although that's been up for debate, is have kids be algebra ready. So is the instruction for that purpose? And then when we get into high school, what is the purpose of the math education there? What is the outcome for most students, right? There are always going to be some students who are going to take higher level extra math. I know my kids are just entered their freshman year, and kids talk about doing double math 1 year so that they can access calculus earlier in their high school sequence. Yep, that'll be some kids, but it's not all kids. And so what is the every kid needs when they leave high school answer? And that's what the instruction should focus on.
Yeah, yeah. But the other thing, and it can happen the opposite way too, where we're taking the student out of a really skilled teacher's classroom and we're putting them in an intervention program that's really not developed that much. And they could be getting something over there, and now they're in here and it's just not very effective. So it's a really tough thing to balance in my experience. I don't think we have all the answers on that.
We don't have all the answers. I think it does go back to the logistics though. Like, have we done the planning ahead of time to figure out what resources we have to help students with what areas, and how are we going to know if they are making progress the way we want them to, and what are we going to do next? So have we done that work to help figure that part out? And maybe that starts to make the whole entire process work better. But I totally understand. I mean, we worked with a district once that, and this was in the area of reading, but you got a certain reading intervention depending on the training of the special education case manager. So it didn't matter what your actual needs were. You got assigned to that case manager. They're trained in that particular program. That's the program that you receive.
Yeah, that's thank you for tying all that together, by the way. That's that's great. We're gonna move to the next question around fluency. Fluency's been talked about a lot lately on social media, especially. It seems like the missing component of a lot of teaching. And maybe you can answer some questions I've had, burning questions around fluency. How does fluency fit into like an instructional hierarchy, and what implications does it have for teaching?
So I have been working with fluency ever since graduate school when I learned about rate-based measures. And so this is something that I always find fascinating that we're still talking about, right? Because we know reading fluency is important. We know fluency is important for learning how to play an instrument or play a sport. So why do we continuously have this battle in education about when and where to use fluency, right? So I think that's interesting that we keep having this, that it's happening in math. And it's super important. I also think about it in terms of the instructional hierarchy. So I love that you frame the question that way. So it's accurate and automatic responding. I don't mind the use of automatic responding. There are people that do have certain ways that they think this should be phrased. I don't mind any of the acronyms or any of the terms that are used or interchanged with automaticity. So accurate and automatic responding. Another way that I like to think about it is remembering or retaining. Inherently in the instructional hierarchy, if that is your heuristic or framework from which you are trying to assess students' skill development and then identify how to match them to the appropriate instructional strategy, then you think about fluency as being that second stage of skill development. So if a student has been taught the underlying concepts of a skill, displays accurate responding, and is answering the problem, but it's taking a really long time for them to compute the answer, then they need to build fluency. And students ultimately need opportunities to practice using that skill so that they become accurate and automatic. So fluency really is that necessary step that also ultimately leads to transfer. So when I kind of talk about it, I like to use those sport and music analogies because I think it's maybe easier for people to hang on to. So with piano, right, you have to learn the keys and the corresponding finger positions. If that process is slow, but it's still accurate, it does not sound like a song, right? It sounds like pounding that's happening. But once you become accurate and automatic, then you can hear the melodies. In sports, I use soccer. That's just what we've played in our family. So you learn ball skills, you learn how to pass with one other person, and you do that in isolation. Then you have to do that with multiple people. But if you don't become fluent with those skills and you get in a game situation, the game's going to go on around you, right? You are not going to be involved in that game. So you have to be accurate and fluent with those skills, and then you can apply them to that game situation. And so I think this is the other part that's really important that goes back to the instructional hierarchy, because it illustrates that fluency is necessary to transfer skills. It's the go between acquiring a skill and transferring that skill.
So if there's two parts of fluency, the speed part and then there's the accuracy part, both of those have come under fire by some folks. So the accuracy part can be stated as, in math, it doesn't matter if you get the right answers. It so and so. It matters if you're a mathematical thinker or whatever they say. Mm-hmm. And then the other one, the speed one, is I think the really contentious piece, which is that you don't need to be fast. I knew a guy who was a genius at math. They tell an anecdote, who did math really slowly, or did lots of things slowly. Ignoring accuracy for a moment, why is speed something we're missing when it comes to teaching math?
So, I mean, we have a lot of really cool data in this space. And the mathematical thinking question, I can't really answer for you because how do we measure that? How do we know? I'm a data person. So that one's sort of elusive, and that's elusive. In math, we know that when skills are not fluent, you have a hard time generalizing those skills over time and across different instructional texts. We actually have that documented. So when the work gets more complicated and it gets more difficult and it's more laborious to solve those problems, the problems don't get solved because they don't have that fluent foundational skills ready to access. Fluent responding leads to more efficient and effective practice across settings, across contexts, across formats, across problem types. This is the benefits of fluency have been illustrated across disciplines. So, I kind of think about things more from a behavioral lens, but it's certainly been illustrated in a cognitive framework as well. We know that both number combination and accuracy have been shown to independently contribute to future success with word problem solving, fraction learning, and pre-algebraic skills. Now, I'm a psychologist. Psychologists have a replication crisis, right? This actual study, there's a direct replication of this finding. So there's two studies, one from 2011, Carr and Elaviv, and then Fuchs did it, and I believe somewhere in 2016 to 18. They also found that same thing. And then there was this whole study of fraction learning, and they found similar things. So we're repeatedly finding this to be true. We know from interdisciplinary work that early fluent performance with math facts results in higher overall math performance later in elementary school and high school. Students without fluent retrieval of basic facts, if we're using that as an example, use more cognitive resources to retrieve the solution than typically performing peers. And then that's problematic because when students try to solve more complex problems, they experience math avoidance, math anxiety, and don't even persist at the problem. I mean, that's my common answer to that. I mean, maybe that's not satisfying, but
well, I think maybe it's the method of getting students to be fluent that people associate with fluency instruction is just not. People don't like the optics around it, right? When they think of a student getting fluent in anything, whether it's whether it's playing an instrument or playing sports or whatever, they think of drills, right? And they think of whole class teaching. They think of students working individually on large sets of problems, often with a timer, right? And it just doesn't sit well with them. So I think, I mean, maybe you can touch on how to develop fluency in a way that brings joy in the classroom, that brings a satisfaction a little bit.
I mean, I love this question. And of course, you know that like the next part of what I would say is yes, in order to build fluency, first and foremost, you need productive opportunities for practice. There's like some cool data that shows like the quality of school-based rehearsal and practice that you use predicts math competency in adulthood. Some experts actually say the majority of instructional time should be about practice. So how do you make practice fun? We also underestimate how much practice is needed. I think that's a problem. So productive opportunities to practice is something that we talked about in my grad program often. What is it? And I think if we know what it is, then maybe we can do it and feel good about it. Also, practice is not unidimensional. It is has many different components depending on where you are in sort of that learning hierarchy that we've been talking about. I'll start with I'll tell you what productive practice is and hope that it sounds a little fun. And then I'm going to go back up though and talk about different types of practice. So guided practice, right? When a student is building a skill or acquiring a skill, you guide their practice opportunities. Isolated practice is the one I think that people have the most, like you had said, has the most controversy surrounding it. We used to call it drill and kill. I have a colleague who lovingly referred to it as drill and thrill because it is fun for students actually when they are given productive opportunities to practice. They are excited because they can see their own outcomes. That flashcard or working flashcards, I guess, are probably the easiest example of that. And then there's integrated practice. So we're not just doing isolated practice. We have to do integrated practice. So students have to practice with material that includes previously learned skills and currently learned skills. If we are isolating practice by small set sizes, then we have to practice with larger set sizes. So it's really variable. And then there's a cumulative review, right, where students have to integrate all kinds of previously learned skills and concepts. And that, I think, what I see often schools do is use games, which is great, but games is not actually going to build fluency. Games is that good for that cumulative review. It's going to be good for generalization type activities. So how do we make sure that this is going to stick over time and they can integrate those previously learned skills with current learned skills? So games are great. And they aren't going to build fluency per se. Their purpose is a little bit different. So what's a productive opportunity to practice? Well, instructional level. I think this is the application. Why practice has a bad name in math is because we've done this part wrong for so long. We've just said, okay, do this, whatever we're working on. Now you're going to go and do that. And the problem is we are not giving students their just right work, and they need to have work that it's at their instructional level. I mean, you've talked about that already when you talked about your intervention groups. Like, that's the number one thing. So you need to select a skill where a student is about what we actually, this number sounds ridiculous when you talk about it practically, but 93% accurate. Like, that's the number that's come out of the literature, right? High accuracy, right? We're at least 90% accurate. Brief sessions. We're not giving students the same problem over and over and over and over and over for a really long period of time. We're talking about you can do this in 5 to 10-minute sessions. There's even in that practice guide I referred to earlier from 2009, they said 10 minutes total should be fluency building activities. Frequent sessions. We have some cool data that's out there by myself, Brian Ponce, other colleagues that have shown like short practice sessions a couple times a day, especially on those simple foundational skills, is really the way to go. And kids actually do more by breaking it up into small sections, working with small amounts of material at a time, not the entire range of content that you want students to learn. Varying the activities is the thing that I add to this. So we want to, sure, there are computers, there are tablet-based activities. That's great, fine. We can use those. They should meet certain criteria if you're going to use them. We can do peer work. Peer work is a great way to engage students. Again, build social skills along the way and build that fluency. It has to be structured a bit, but we can do that. Certainly use flashcards and paper pencil. So you can vary those activities. And I've written out whole like calendars where I'm like, okay, this day we're going to do this, we're going to do paper pencil. And then in the next 2 days, we're going to do flashcards. So we can change every day. We go through an order and reset. Or by week, we can go through different kinds of activities. The one caveat I would say here is that there's some emerging data to show that if you are only using computer-based practice, that doesn't transfer very well to other kinds of activities, especially paper pencil. So like we have to do paper pencil, like it's important. And then we have to change skills when students make progress. And then involve them in their own learning. They love it because they make choices. Like maybe they'll say, I want to do flashcards today. I don't want to do the computer. Or they look at their progress and they set goals for themselves and they reflect on them. And then we start to get into a place where people really love it. I did a project with Pennsylvania and this pilot little group. The best outcome that they got, they used a peer tutoring class-wide intervention, all about building fluency. And the students' excitement, engagement, and enthusiasm for this project was the thing that the teachers talked most about.
I like that you mentioned games because like I have a big box of math games I'm working with my daughter right now, right? Integrating games. Sometimes that even can be an incentive for the week, right? Is having math game time and so on. But like you mentioned how it might not be the best for fluency. I can definitely illustrate a similar thing, right? You have two kids next to each other and you give them a game and that game can last 20, 30 minutes. Where like I visited Morningside Academy here in Seattle and they do 2-minute or 1-minute timings with acceleration chart, right? In 2 minutes, how many problems that student was able to do in just that very short amount of time compared to how many problems were embedded in the games. I mean, it's just a totally different size of problems there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done that. Didn't set it up, I think, the way that we set it up one way, and the results we got were interesting. Still, I would probably redo this study, but we did that one study that showed like, yeah, opportunities to respond in the actual session itself matters. It just matters a lot. So how much do you get to practice in that time? And there's a lot of things that impede that. How many things you're being asked to practice, and like if you're being given the wrong material, like this stuff that's too hard.
Well, I think too, like with a game, the goal for the student, from the student's perspective, is a little different, right? You're thinking about different things. You're thinking about winning the game. You're thinking about kind of maybe the superficial aspects of the board that's in front of you. You're thinking the little surface features of the toys and the dice rolls on the ground. Where if you do a more targeted practice, you're just thinking about beating your own time, or you're just thinking about the math, right? Which I think is quite a bit different. I put it at the end because it's maybe you are bombarded too often with questions around time testing. So put it towards the end for anyone who sticks around. I think it's important. I feel it in my gut that, having the timer there is important because of measuring the speed of part of fluency. Why is time testing maybe have a role in intervention settings or in mainstream settings? And what is the evidence behind that?
So I think the quick thing that we need to understand is that time tests provide information that accuracy tests cannot. So I think where when we set kids up to just see how accurate they are, we only get a little bit of learning. We don't get all of the learning. Once a child has reached 100% accuracy, that metric can't capture the additional learning that's going to happen. So rate-based metrics, which I think I've now said about 10 times in our conversation, are more reliable and better indicators of students' instructional level. There's a whole other conversation we could have, but we don't have time for that, about actually how like things like curriculum-based measurement have been set up. They actually weren't set up to be timed tests per se. They were set up to identify reliably and validly where a student performs. And they showed in 50 years of research that we can determine that through 1, 2, or short periods of samples of students' responses. So that's a whole separate conversation. So when we think about those timed tests, what we've learned is really, I think, probably counterintuitive to what people have been thinking. I have a whole strand that I want to put out there at some point, putting together all of the studies that we've just recently done. By the way, the reason that I even got into this line of inquiry was all based on what I was seeing and observing in schools and what my students brought back to me and what they weren't able to do. And so we were like, well, we better figure out what this is. And so what we actually learned is that students, when they are faced with challenging problems, they actually want that overt timing to happen. When they don't have that, and it's a challenging problem and it's a covert task, they don't know how long they have to engage in that task, they actually they find that more challenging, and their outcomes are not as good as when we have a timed situation with a challenging task. The other thing we know is that challenging tasks is what seems to be leading to things like math anxiety. So the inappropriate match between where students are and what material students have been given to them. We keep finding that in different ways. So there is no difference with problems that are sort of at the student's accurate instructional level between timed and untimed performance. And there, if anything, we show that kids have benefits from that timed performance if they're fluency building. And we know that across studies. We know that if they have low math anxiety or high math anxiety. So kids with high math anxiety do perform less well than kids with low math anxiety. But if you give everybody a overtly timed task, everybody makes gains. I think that's the simplest way to say it.
So covert and overt, this is how you would do this type of research. And
Sorry.
with the overt timing, the timer is displayed like on the board or something, right? Or the
Yep.
teacher has a kitchen timer, shows it. Where then the covert, you just say everybody begin, and then the timer's hidden for the researcher's purposes, like behind the desk or whatever, right? Like,
Yep.
so you're telling me, and I've seen this in the study, you're telling me that really the kids, there's no difference to them, or that there are slight differences in the kind of qualitative reaction to that timing, those two timing formats?
We actually looked at this a couple different ways. We obviously looked at math anxiety outcomes. We looked at math outcomes, and then we had a separate study where we actually looked at perceived task difficulty and students. So if you were given the let's start with the challenging material. If you were given the challenging material and you were given an overt timed task and a covert timed task, both same challenging material, then students found that challenging material they perceived it to be more difficult with the covert timing, perceived it to be more difficult, and they had displayed more task-specific math anxiety around that.
Yeah, so that it's funny because it almost proves two things at once, right? It suggests that the timing, having the timer be visible to the students, so the students being aware they're in a time condition, isn't the main the main cause of anxiety, and that what could stress them out a lot is actually the how if it's just not an appropriate challenge level of the problems, which goes into the whole world of like productive struggle. You engineer something very difficult for the students that's supposed to come with its own benefits, but I feel like a lot of us have been saying that just stresses kids out and it makes them not feel as smart when they do those type of problems.
So, I mean, we have actually saw that in some of the meta-analyses that have been done on math anxiety. So, but that was looking at correlational relationships. So we were able, like you said, to try to tackle this through an experimental mechanism, which helps us really understand it a little bit better.
I'm looking forward to this research being, extended and getting stronger. Yeah, it's just going to be one of those kind of math wars things for a while until we have maybe a little bit better data. That's just that giving students something that's really tough, that is beyond what they can do outside of their ZPD, we used to call it, can lead to all different types of behaviors that are not beneficial for learning. I'm really excited. What do you see in terms of, maybe our last question, what do you see as like the next areas of research that are needed, or maybe limitations of current research?
Yeah, so so we have done single case design work to illustrate some of these outcomes, and we have done within group designs rather than a randomized controlled trial. So there needs to be randomized controlled trials, kind of looking at this specifically. That is something that we are working on. We are submitting grant work to try to get that done. There is also mechanism work, so understanding what is happening to the students when they are looking at this challenging material. Like, what is the thing that's going on? Sometimes it's they're having less opportunities, they're less productive in their practice. So why is that happening? I think it would be great to try to uncover why that's happening. And then the thing that I also am interested in, of course, is like, well, what do we do about it? Like, what is the intervention? How do we address it? And so how do we compare different kinds of tactics that are easy to use in school that are actually going to address it?
Love it. Well, I'm going to be posting a lot of these links in the show notes for people who want to find, continue the professional reading and their journey. Where can listeners find your work? Like maybe some of your links and things that can be helpful to them to, like, if they want to learn more.
Yeah. So you can find me at Northeastern University. I have a bio link there. I have some work there. I have podcasts that are like in the ether. So I feel like, or webinars that are in the ether. So you can Google me, and you can also email me. So that is sort of a good way to go.
Love it. Robin Codding, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Listeners, thank you for tuning in. Lots more episodes coming your way in the next few weeks. I really appreciate your support. If you could just hit 5 stars and spread it to, a colleague who needs to learn about this topic, that would be great. And otherwise, Robin, thanks so much for coming on the show. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.